Yeah, welcome everyone. Thank you very much for tuning in. It'll be a fantastic opportunity we've got here just to put some stuff across. I'm a land services officer with Local Land Services here in Armidale. Many may know me, but amongst many things that I've done, I have run a northern section in Queensland of an NGO, and I have tremendous respect for what SLA does, and it actually gets out there and does stuff. And we'd like to show, certainly within Local Land Services and the team we've got together, that we're also doing stuff. So that's important. What this is about, it's about birds of prey, and it's about helping them in this region. Yeah. We're looking to science to learn more, but we do need help from the community, and that's one of the reasons that we're talking tonight with you. Stephen Davis will talk about the birds. Huge amount of experience, and he's an on-ground surveyor. And Associate Professor Paul McDonald will talk about a lot about the ecology and what we're doing currently and what potentially we can do. And we'll round this off, Paul will round this off by indicating to everyone here how you can help and how you can take part. So that's basically it from me. We'll let Steve loose.
Okay, thanks, Ewan. Right, well, raptors as apex predators are indicators of environmental health, and also being at the top of the food chain, they're umbrella species, I guess, which means that they, with their large home ranges and the sort of habitats they occupy, they take in, if you protect raptors, it takes in a whole lot of other species as well. So they're two of the main reasons why the Northern Tablelands Local Land Services Bird of Prey Monitoring Project is going, and it's focusing on the threatened species which are listed as vulnerable in New South Wales under the Biodiversity Conservation Act. So our target species and the Square-tailed Kite, which are both woodland species, and the White-bellied Sea-Eagle, which is a wetland species mainly, but it also needs forest or woodland in which to nest. And we have a couple of secondary target species, if you like. So we thought we might have had spotted harriers here until the nest failed. We did have one pair nesting, but they've gone. And the occasional black falcon through, and barking owls were one of our target species, especially in the first year of the project. We've got a few nests of those, but being nocturnal, I can't follow them as well as the daytime ones all the time. And anyway, the aim of the project is to maintain populations of these raptors and also ecosystem health, because if you've got good, healthy raptor populations, you know, you've got a good, healthy environment as well. And in terms of measuring how they're faring, the sort of things we're looking for to tell us how they're faring is their population numbers and density, and the distribution of nests, and their annual breeding success, how many young they produce each year. And the project has been going since 2017 with LLS, but we have some baseline data going back. I looked at little eagles just out of interest as a voluntary project from 2006 to 2009, and I knew then of about 10 territories around Armidale, and their annual productivity was, a way of thinking of it is about 2 out of 3 pairs got a young one off on average each year, so about 0.63 young per pair per year. Yeah, which basically means in round figures about 2/3 of the pairs got a young one off each year on average. And they feed mainly on rabbits, but they also take some other woodland, native woodland species as well. So as far as the sea-eagles go, I knew back in the 2000s of nests at Malpas Dam, at Little Llangollen Lagoon, at Lake Inverell, at the UNE Toowoomba property out near Kingstown, and the one at the trout hatchery. And their productivity, the number of young they produced around the 2007 mark was just under, on average, about one young one per pair per year. I think it was actually 0.8 because you get the occasional nest failure of any of these species for various reasons. And the square-tailed kite, they're quite sparse on the tablelands. I knew of a few historical nests. There was one at Inverell, which failed. There was one at Tinga, which had a fledgling, and there was a pair at Hieraaetus, which had a chick, I think, in most years from 2011 to 14. And there was a nest at Torryburn, which I never saw, but I know they did nest there. And it's quite a specialised species. It's a woodland specialist. It feeds on native prey from the treetops mainly, and it needs large patches of woodland. So with that sort of information, the Northern Tablelands project kicked off in 2017 with Candice Larkin, who was doing an honours project at UNE at the time. And that was focused on little eagles. And since then, Candice has been working on them ever since as well. And we've been gradually improving the number of nest sites we know about as we extend the search and find more. But we had 12 nests in 2017 and we had 17 in 2020. And we had up to 21 territories identified, but that's between Armidale, or 15 kilometres east of Armidale, right out to up to Inverell, Bundarra, Inverell, and Kingstown. And I even knew of a couple further out towards Barraba as well. But so we had quite a number of nests in the end, with a fair bit of searching each year. Sea eagles. Well, we've been monitoring the known nests since 2017, the ones I mentioned, plus we were fortunate to be told of one on private land down near Walker as well. So that's in the database now. And Square had a number of sightings from 2017 to 2020, and then I eventually found 2 nests last year in 2020, including the first record of nesting kites in Imbota Nature Reserve. And I've been working in Imbota since the 1980s, and I spent from 2000 to 2003 out there nearly every day, and never found a nest, although I occasionally sighted one. But they've turned up nesting this year, or at least we found them anyway. Another aspect of Candice's project was measuring nest site characteristics, and among the things that she determined was that little eagles need emergent mature trees to nest in, more than 20 metres tall, in patches of mature woodland of at least 5 hectares and at least 1 kilometre from the suburbs. Okay, so they're out in the surrounding countryside. And both of those species, one thing we established was that they like bird-rich patches of woodland. So they like the biodiverse, good, healthy patches with a lot of native faunal diversity. And on to what's been happening since 2017. Well, in 2017 and 18, we've got a similar number of young per pair per year as in the previous survey in 2006 to 09. We had was right on the 0.67. So 2/3 of pairs got a young one off in those 2 years on average. But it was very poor in 2019, the drought year. Was less than 1/3 of the pairs got a young one off. So 0.29 in fact, so that's a bit under 1/3. There was a partial recovery after the drought in 2020. It was almost 1 in 2, or almost half of the pairs got one young one off on average in that year. But some territories around Armidale are being lost to urban expansion and high density sort of rural residential zones. There's a couple of pairs now I can't find anymore that I used to know about. I'm afraid I don't have any photos to share. I'm actually not a photographer. I've relied on other people to take the photos, but if someone can flash some up, that'd be great. Maybe shortly after this talk. As far as the sea eagles go, they've been doing pretty badly in the dry years. Like in 2017 to 2020, only about 1 in 4 pairs got a young one off. And in the drought year, it was 1 in 5 pairs got a young one off. Some didn't even attempt to breed, and without only one of the 9 pairs was successful. And we thought we'd lost the little Langothan lagoon pair because that completely dried up. But latest news last week or so is that there's a pair back there now that there's water in the lagoon, I imagine, but it may be too late for them to breed this year, and it might be next year before they actually get to breed there again. As far as the kites go, they were the ones that we found in 2020. I speculate they may have been fire refugees from further towards the coast. All that forest was burnt, so I know they're more common down the coast and on the escarpment than they are up here on the tableland. So perhaps we got a couple of pairs moved up here away from the burnt areas. But one of those pairs raised 2 young, which is good for them, and 1 pair failed. It was the Imboda nest that did well, but they've since lost their nest to the storms. So they're building a new nest this year. When do they breed? Okay, there's a question on there. They breed in spring. Well, the sea eagles start laying in about late July, and they'd normally be pretty much hatched or have a chick by now. Little eagles have started. The pairs this year, some are on eggs already, some haven't quite laid. They're still building or rebuilding or relining previous nests. And the kites, they're back and sort of looking like they're starting to build. So they're a bit staggered like that, and that's basically a body size thing. The biggest ones start earliest, and the smaller ones a bit later. So I was going to move on to a brief review of the climate-related threats, because I know we're focused on. Oh, okay. There's a question come up here. The previous question. I'll need to have a look at it again. Perhaps at the end, I can go through those questions. The data and modelling and everything and predictions and all that say that climate change will bring in increasing frequency, length and severity of droughts, heat waves, storms and deluges and so on. So what it means for these raptors is that the little eagles, I found in the drought that part of their problem was tree death, which exposed nests. I had nests that were built in trees that died, and then the nests failed. And I also think the drought reduced their prey supply as well. So the storms have destroyed nests and nest trees. Imboda was littered with fallen trees, but fortunately it didn't take out any of the nest trees while they're active. And heavy rain, deluges can kill nestlings as well, small downy chicks. So the overall result for little eagles is reduced fledgling productivity each year. They'll have less breeding success, and we've got local evidence of that, and there's also evidence from the ACT. There's people in parallel studying little eagles in the ACT that have got similar data, reduced productivity in the drought, and then some chick deaths in a very wet spring. For the sea eagle, the main impact was loss of wetland habitat. The drought just dried up their wetland habitat and food supplies, and so territories were abandoned, if only temporarily, and nests failed. They just didn't even attempt to breed, some of them. We had storms destroy a nest or two and nest tree as well. In one case, I think we had a couple of nests lost, including the whole tree in one case. So again, the impact has been reduced fledgling output and reduced population, but the population might return when the water returns, but they still have to build up their number of young they're producing. As far as the kite goes, the square-tailed kite, the drought and fire and storms all destroy foraging and breeding habitat and reduce prey, and rain will kill, heavy rain like deluges that we're going to expect with climate change will kill nestlings. So again, the impact's going to be reduced productivity and population. And I mentioned all that storm damage in Imbota last summer. It was just amazing that the nest trees actually survived, even if one nest has to be rebuilt this year. Now, so the prediction from all that, heat waves also may kill nestlings. The parents will shade nestlings. They'll stand on the nest and hold their wings out and shade nestlings. But there comes a point where it gets too hot for them, so they'll seek shade, and then the heat wave could still kill nestlings. And the overall prediction is that populations of these raptors will decline. In the context of climate change, I see the biggest threat as ongoing land clearing, because native forest and woodland protects not only the species and their habitats, but it protects catchments and it maintains the water cycle. And now I saw a question pop up on this topic. I was going to briefly mention that the growth of wind farms and other renewables, there is a concern that the large raptors particularly do suffer from collisions with wind turbine blades, and also solar farms have the potential to occupy hectares of habitat. So I guess it's a matter of planning where these things go. But I'll get to that as well. I just thought I'd mention some potential interventions to try to reduce the impacts from climate change on these birds, and therefore the ecosystems that they occupy, because they're sitting at the top of the food chain. So I'd suggest greater protection for little eagle breeding habitat and nest sites, which means good patches of mature bushland around Armidale and beyond, which could start with mapping of little eagle nest sites and nest patches, and feed the data to council so they can incorporate the habitat of threatened species into planning. And for that, we need more nest records. So that's where the Tablelands Raptor project comes in. We also need, looking long term, we need recruits for future mature woodland. So we need some vegetation reconnection, especially of riparian zones, because these raptors do nest on streams or rivers, sea-eagles particularly, but little eagles and kites. The further inland you go, the more their nest sites are restricted to riparian zones. And even around Armidale, there was a significant relationship between little eagle nests and proximity to some sort of stream or watercourse. And so rehabilitation of watercourses with the original tree species would be part of that recruiting for future mature woodland. And also to do with that, fixing the many degraded and eroded watercourses for bank stability in the flood times that are going to come with the deluges that are predicted. Threatened species habitat needs to be on the radar for council planners. And we could look to koalas as being an obvious red flag, but perhaps little eagles could also be an icon species. And on the matter of wind farms and so on, it just means planning to site wind farms away from areas where raptors use topography to gain lift for soaring and so on and moving. So that means mapping raptor use areas. And with solar farms, I guess it means careful planning to make sure we're not removing forest or woodland habitat to put solar farms in. And I'd just like to finish with a plea for information on where nests are, especially our target species, but I guess any raptor nests. And if people are not sure what they are, then digital photos of the birds can be identified. So, and we'd be grateful for any nest records and photos of birds if you don't know what they are. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Stephen. Paul, I will spotlight you.
Thanks for that, Anne. And so can everyone hear me? How's that sound, guys? Yeah, good. Excellent. Well, I might just share my screen. There's a couple of questions popping up there. Did you want me to push on, or did you want to do some questions?
Yeah, maybe we should round out these questions. There was one about the life expectancy of these raptors. Stephen, what are the life expectancy of little eagles and kites, etc.?
There's no information on the kites. The sea eagle, there's not much information, but I know of one that was 19 years as a breeding adult. For the little eagles, there's a few records of between, say, 15 and 24 years. The record is 26 years, but it seems on average in the agricultural belt, all age classes on average, the life expectancy is about 5 years or so. But that's because a lot of birds in their first year don't survive their first winter. So, but breeding adults, if they get to be breeders, they could live potentially 20 years or so. I think in the 80s, or by 1990, I think I estimated their lifespan was about 19 years, but lately in the 2000s that had halved. It was more like about 9 years with a higher mortality rate, higher turnover rate. Yeah.
Stephen, there was another question from Liz who asked one about age as well. How old would a chick be when they go out on their own?
Okay. Well, it depends on the size of the bird, but the kites and the little eagles are probably about 2 months in the nest before they can fly, and then they're still fed. Little eagles at least anyway, and the kites probably too, are still fed by their parents for another couple of months or so, and they become independent. At least little eagles anyway, at about 3 months after they leave the nest, and then they disperse. And the Canberra people have established that they actually migrate up to the tropics for the winter and then come back.
Thanks, Steve.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, well, I think we'll push on. Paul, take the stage.
Right, thank you. Well, I've got some images there to have a look. So this is a square-tailed kite. This bird was out on the Swern River, actually, a bit further away, but just so you start getting those visuals, and we'll rattle through some images of the others after this. But now Steve's sort of given you an overview of what we know at this point. What I thought I'd talk about is how what we're looking to do in the coming years, and where the focus is shifting, and how we could potentially do with people's help to get us where we need to be. So that is the plan and what I'll talk about. All right, so for these guys, this is a little eagle, by the way, hopping over a tree. There's a magpie, came down to swoop it. This one's out at Invergary, so we do have birds in the local region near Armidale. The core aim of what we're trying to do, important to come back to that, and I wanted just to have that here to remind myself, is what we're trying to do is both maintain and then improve the current populations we've got of these guys. They are of conservation concern, so it's not enough just to maintain what we've got. We want to move forward and actually grow some of these populations. So that's the long-term aim. But to do that, that would hopefully, as Steve mentioned, lead to additional gains for other taxa and other threatened species. But we need some information to do that, and that's where we're looking at for the strategy and what we do going forward. So that's what I'm talking about, how we get that information, if you like. So 3 species of interest that we're looking at. I want to just talk a little bit about what we know and some of the challenges that we're aware of that we're going to have to solve, but also looking at how we can build on what we know to get to that information as quickly and as efficiently as we can. And I noticed there was a question in the chat. Sorry, I don't have it in front of me. I can't remember who asked it, but there will be opportunities to get involved, and we'll talk about how you can do that as well. So rest assured, there's chances for you to do things too. All right, so this is the little eagle. I'm going to very crudely attempt to summarize all that data that Steve's just presented in a few dot points. So apologies, Steve, in advance, but these are some of the sort of take homes, I think, for the key species. We're very fortunate to have a reasonable, in terms of relative size, population of little eagles in the local area, which is fantastic. So we've got a lot to deal with and a lot to work with. They are relatively tolerant. So even though they're sort of about 1 kilometre outside the urban area that Steve was talking about, in some cases they can tolerate some human activity. It's not you know, the desired output, and having them tucked away in quiet areas is better, but they are tolerant in some cases. So that's promising, gives us something to work with. But we also know that nest tree loss is an issue. The loss of big, large trees that they favour for nesting is not unique to this species, but it's obviously having an impact on these guys. So there's some things to work with. Okay, that's not working. Sorry, just bear with me. I will have to just get out of that. It's kind of interesting that didn't work. Just bear with me, people. I'll see. Okay. All right. I won't touch anything and I'll stop breathing. Then hopefully that will fix the slide. But if not, we'll drop the animation. But anyway, this is the square-tailed kite. As Steve was talking about and mentioning, it's probably the one we know the least about. I think that's partly because they can be difficult to identify. As you can see, they're very similar to little eagle superficially, and I think they're not as well known as some of the other taxa. They tend to be a bit more sparsely distributed, but there's that trade-off. Perhaps they're a little bit underreported as well. But as Steve also mentioned, they're relying on those larger patches. So they're of concern, and we need to keep an eye on these guys and learn some more about them. And the last one there is white-bellied sea-eagles. Obviously need a better picture of that one, but that's a job for post-lockdown, Paul. We know discrete locations of these guys. So the lagoons, Llangollen, for example, we know where to find the breeding adults. Probably know less about the young birds, and they can be more mobile and pop up at places we wouldn't otherwise expect them. So that's an area of interest that we need to know more about. And clearly drought impacts them. They're not just restricted to the ocean, they're also on the inland waterways as well, but no water means no eagles, or at least no breeding eagles in a lot of these areas. So Llangollen certainly the case in recent times. Add up all of that, and we've also got the additional complexity and issues that are facing them in terms of bushfire and drought, things that we in the pre-COVID world tend to get swept under the carpet a bit, but that's unfortunately something that will continue to impact our area going forward and need to be able to deal with. And of course, climate change and those more extreme conditions. And all of that boils down into, it's quite likely that if we do nothing with these species, that those populations are going to continue to decline or start declining in cases that are holding their own. So we need to do something, and we need to start that process in an efficient way now. So that's really what we're looking to do. So key challenges with these guys, well, they move over large areas and they're inclined to cross the fence that you may not necessarily want them to. That involves multiple stakeholders that we need to be dealing with when we're looking at some birds. Different stakeholders have different attitudes to these, so these can be quite challenging, how we interact with those and make sure we're looking to build good relationships with people and benefit the birds in a long-term scenario. And also the species vary in how reliable they are in an area year to year, particularly for different usage, and depending on the factors that shift that, we're not always clear on. So obviously water and sea-eagles is a good example where we can be quite predictive about that, but for some of the other taxa and things that are more sparse like kites, the square-tailed kites rather, it's more difficult to narrow that down. So that can be quite challenging to predict that and use that to focus our search area. To date, we've been focusing on breeding activity, and that's the royal we, that's Steve and Candice running around and finding all these areas and areas of activity. Been a fantastic effort, but we're also interested in what happens outside of that. And particularly, we talked already about that dependence period where you have recent fledglings that are still being fed by the adults, but they tend to wander a little bit more. Perhaps that's a vulnerable period of their life cycle as well. So we need to keep be aware of these challenges, work out what the animals are up to, and identify what's impacting their success, positive or negative, so that we look to manage that going forward. So we need to get some data on that part of their life cycle too. And I think that could be a real flagship species. I resisted the Photoshop urge to put eagle wings on this koala, but clearly when we think of managing woodlands and species that we think about, koala is top of the list for most people, and how we make sure we preserve koalas. And likewise, I think there's a real benefit to thinking about these raptors in that way, in terms of that spin-off of preserving large amounts of habitat and all the species that are using that, but also that iconic role in attraction people have towards eagles. So I think that's and raptors in general, something we can use to make people aware of their flight and build on that. But what we actually need is that evidence-based action, and that's really where we're coming from. We need to get some good data so we've got a good handle on what's happening, and then we can action accordingly and be as efficient as we can be, so we start turning these populations around as soon as possible. So some knowledge gaps at the moment. Would be really nice to do some population modelling and some viability analysis, and actually start looking at how these populations are tracking in the region, and whether we have enough birds for that to be sustainable, and some of the areas that we should be most worried about. We need to get some more data over a wider area to do that effectively. And we need to then understand what's going on in this region, but also then start comparing that to a broader area and what else is happening in the southeast of the country and other parts of the country where these taxa occur, and try and use that to identify areas of concern and what we can do to assist the animals. And we obviously need help to do that, because there's only so much you can do on your own. There's key areas of concern. We've talked about nest trees a little bit already tonight. This is a good example, a local TSR. We've got, unfortunately, the nest trees and the mistletoe that the nest is in. It's perished in the drought. The birds are still there, but the nest tree is now no longer suitable. It's quite open, and there's not much cover there. So to date, they haven't actually reused it, even though they're still around and looking to breed, unfortunately. So identifying those key areas is something that's really important to do. And also looking at that and making those areas known. So it's fine to preserve an area when the eagles are nesting, but we need to look after that tree year round and ultimately build towards renewal. So we start replacing some of those trees and enhancing that habitat. But we need to know where to put those. And habitat's that key word, really. We need to think about modelling where these animals are and getting a good idea of where we should be looking, so we can focus our effort in those key areas. And that's something that would be very useful going forward. But we need that information. Our model's only as good as the data you feed it. So we need to give that really good information so we know what we're looking at going forward. Right, known unknowns. Don't normally like to quote American politicians, but I quite like that one, so I'll hang on to that one. But I think non-breeding season is one that stands out to me in terms of the birds are harder to get a handle on where they're moving, but that's something that we need to keep an eye on, and we just need more information where they are. And absence data there is a really good one. A lot of these modelling techniques require data on both presence and absence, so we need to actually know where people are looking and not finding the birds as well, and starting to split that down into interesting things like sex or age of the birds. In some of these species, you can identify that. That might be really interesting, so we can start to look for those impacts and start modelling those and getting an idea of what that means for the birds. And beyond that, we also need to start thinking about within and between territories and how those individual pairs are impacted by the things going on around them. It might be changing land use. We've talked about potential for solar farms, wind farms, etc. As those structures are being deployed in the region, we need to look at how that impacts on the birds, but also where we can maximise revegetation efforts, for example, and looking at that impact and making sure that that's actually doing something for the animals. And moving beyond that nest success failure and starting to identify additional components, more detail, that finer scale detail with a larger group of people looking. Unfortunately, we're not allowed to clone Steves, so we can deploy multiple Steves throughout the world. So we need to actually have more people out there looking, and depending on people's time and what they're able to do, we're going to have different levels of data. But by doing that, we're able to start looking at some of these additional details, and that's going to be really informative. For example, if we know that particular nesting area, so this is a square-tailed kite nesting in Boda, if we know in a particular area that they're failing at a certain stage, that helps us pinpoint the cause of that failure, for example. And things like diet and so on, we get an idea of what they're actually using in that local environment, and use that to inform the actions that we might need to take going forward. As well as understanding the habitat, to do that, we need that bigger group of people looking, and that's where that engagement side of thing comes in. And really, because these birds are across a whole range of different stakeholder areas, we really need that engagement. And we've been fortunate to date that a number of working groups and workshops not working groups, that have been held by you and his team and various others around the region actually talking about this. We've got a whole range of people who have actually engaged thus far, really looking to build on that and look for people to come on board and assist us, and hopefully we can talk more about that tonight. But that's the sort of thing that we need, and people with different skill sets to actually contribute to this data set and assist us in this process. So that's really where we want to go with this. In terms of improving data efficiency, there is a number of different things that we might be able to do, again, to take the focus off spending time traveling around to these different areas that has, as people visit nests, etc., there's potential welfare issues that we can minimize by automating some of this data collection. So things like using passive bioacoustics, for example, it's a new area we're getting into where we're able to hear the birds being fed, able to look at that audio and listen to that audio, and beyond feeding rate, we might be able to pick up activity rates. So we can look at when the nest failed, or on a more positive note, hopefully when the fledgling leaves the area and we know that the nest is successful without visiting it, other than installing that recorder early on and coming back later to pick it up after several weeks. Nest cameras, there's a number of nest cameras online, so you probably, if you Google, there's a Sea-Eagle one in Sydney that BirdLife runs, but there's also a peregrine falcon one in Melbourne, for example. So you can, more difficult to set up, but in terms of that information, a way of gathering remote data on what the birds are eating, how the chicks are going, etc. And really in the day where people have good cameras, there's a possibility if we get photos, we can start identifying individuals if they have key features such as a missing feather or the like, and also collecting more information. So these animals, when they're consuming large bits of prey, they can't digest it all, so they bring pellets up. So you're able to look at that and identify what they've been eating from those remains that they bring back up. So collecting those for later analysis might be a relatively small investment at each nest, but give us lots of information going forward. How we actually look to do that. So Landcare have been working with David Ward to produce some really good media, and there'll be a couple of training videos coming out, both for general interest, but also looking to train people up how to actually collect some of this data and what we're looking to do. So that's really exciting, and there'll be more to come on that later this year. Looking to build a database so we can start recording these entries and capture that information and build on what we have so that people can contribute if they're interested. And really providing a portal, which I'll get to in a moment, so that we can provide that engagement for people to talk about what they're seeing with their raptors and report their sightings, but also generate that interest so that word of mouth grows and we get people looking for these animals. Really give people something to for their efforts as well is important, I think. And Steve mentioned other species we might be looking at. I'm not sure if you can see my mouse, but the top of that is a little eagle being mobbed by an Australian magpie there. So mapping where magpies are and the impact of magpies might be important. Noisy miners, for example, come to mind as potential negative species that might impact these raptors. Likewise, the next picture down there is a wedge-tailed eagle nest. Wedge-tailed eagles are our biggest raptors, so where you get wedgies, as a result, you don't tend to get the other guys. They rule the roost and kick the others out. So again, while they're not of a significant conservation concern, knowing where there's wedge tails is important information. and broadening beyond that to other threatened taxa. Steve also talked about the spotted harrier down the bottom there, and of course the barking owl as well, are other species of concern we're potentially interested in. So there's a range. With more people, we can do more things, so that we might be able to expand into those areas too. So timeline, really still building on and starting to develop that strategy and solidify some of these plans throughout this year. So starting that process and really ramping up next year across the next, formalising a 5-year strategy, and ramping that engagement, starting to roll that out so we can really look to build on this and start gathering some really useful information and help the birds over that short to medium term, I guess. And once we have that, we can start hopefully informing both landholders, but also decision makers, and feeding this information to council and the like, so that they're aware of this information and can take it on board. But again, to do this, we need that community involvement across that multiple levels. So that's what we're looking to do. So I think I've spoken enough. So I'll just link to the Raptors in Northern New South Wales Facebook site. If you Google or search for that title within Facebook, it should pop up and you can join. That's where we're going to put our information. So as new things come online, new information on ways to get involved and activities and how you can do that. So keep an eye out on that and join that. And if you have sightings that you'd like to report, there's contact details for you and Steve and myself there if you'd like to forward that information through.